What's up, everybody? Welcome in to Talking College Football right here on my YouTube channel, the Phillip Jordan Sports channel. You can also check out the podcast on all your favorite podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, wherever you get your podcast, you can check out Talking College Football. I am your host, Phillip Jordan from Last Word on College Football and 96.9 The Legend in Dothan, Alabama. I'm an in-studio host and producer for Dothan Woods Football and host of the Wiregrass High School Football Report. Happy Wednesday to everybody. Hope you're having a great day so far. We're going to have a fun podcast, fun show for you here today. We'll be going an hour like I did on Monday. But, look, I took 2 weeks off, had a lot to talk about on Monday's pod. Good feedback from the conversation with Barry McKnight. Good call, stuff being said about the open, good stuff said about the podcast. So I appreciate that from you. So on today's show, I'm going to be talking Ole Miss Rebels football, previewing the Ole Miss Rebels with Jared Redding from Inside the Rebels over at the 247 Sports Network. He'll be on. We get a good 30-minute conversation talking about the Ole Miss Rebels. And that's going to be your podcast. There's no open, so we're about to jump right into it. Just real quickly, remember you can follow me on social media at PJordanSEC. Podcast is on social media on Twitter at TalkingCFBPod. Of course, you can always email me at sports.philipjordan@gmail.com. Now, let's preview the Ole Miss Rebels. Everybody joining me on the show today, one of the more anticipated teams, curious teams about this upcoming season, the Ole Miss Rebels. And joining me is Jared Redding. You can check his workout covering Ole Miss over at Inside the Rebels for 247 Sports. And Jared, appreciate you taking time to come on the show for a little bit, talk to Ole Miss Rebels.
Thank you for having me, man. And yeah, I mean, I think you said it best in the intro. It's a very confusing team. You come out, of course, Ole Miss is coming off of their first 10-win regular season in program history. Was just a game away from making it 11. They lost in last year's Sugar Bowl to prevent them from doing so. But a lot of new faces, but a lot of new talented faces. So there's a lot of pieces in that puzzle. We'll just see how that puzzle fits this season.
Yeah, and of course, obviously it's a college football show, but the Ole Miss is coming off the national championship in baseball. So have the Ole Miss fans, are they ready to transition away from baseball yet? Are they still celebrating that? Not quite ready to jump to the football excitement because the season's a month and a half away, which and is that bleeding into? I wonder if that's going to bleed into football, the excitement, because you sometimes see. And I know I'm asking you a lot of questions off the top here, but sometimes you see when one sport does really well, it kind of the next sport does really well too. Just has that excitement jumped over to football yet though?
That's a really good question to bring up because that was the first men's national championship at Ole Miss, first ever NCAA recognized national championship in any sports. Of course, they claimed 3 national football titles back in the late 50s, early 60s. But based on that, a lot of things went into last season's baseball season. Obviously, they were the last teams to make an NCAA tournament. There was questions about the dean of SEC coaches, Mike Bianco, if he was going to be there. And fortunate that they made the tournament and they made the most of their tournament. They went 10-1 in the postseason. They outscored their opponents 82-25 in the postseason. And if you check Twitter and if you're, follow a lot of the Ole Miss fan base and you follow a lot with that, they're not going to get over that for a while. But at the same time, college football, college baseball is growing exponentially. Don't get me wrong. College football is such a big part of the state of Mississippi. Now, it's kind of because Mississippi State winning a national championship last year and Ole Miss winning a national championship this year. It's kind of the question is Ole Miss a baseball state? Because a lot of it, a lot of it is overlooked. That Ole Miss, despite not having a national championship contending football team in the past couple of years. I mean, last year's Ole Miss team, kind of getting a little bit close, and both teams kind of getting close in the mid 2010s or so. But Mississippi produces a lot of football talent, across the board, and a lot of who Mississippi is defined by its football. It's something that really unites the state, bringing together. So it's a kind of a good question that you ask. I'm not exactly sure, but I think, like you said, I think it will blend in together and have a good mix. It's just an appreciation of Ole Miss.
That's the thing. Of course, I live in the state of Alabama. We talk about the passion of Alabama Auburn. I think a lot of people who maybe are not from the South. I know everybody in Mississippi knows. I mean, that the passion for football in those two programs is just as strong as it is anywhere else. And I think a lot of people just don't know that. And I'm kind of hoping now with Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss, Mike Leach at Mississippi State, those games, getting bigger with those two teams being very successful, that more of the country will see what Mississippi is all about when it comes to football and the passion that the fans have, and where it is comparable to pretty much anybody else in the country.
Yeah, I think it was a cool thing to kind of bring up, even when both of them were hired, because if people don't know that they were hired within a couple months of each other. Back in 2019, I think Mike Leach was right around the New Year's time because he was a little bit after Kiffin. But it's two guys who were not even remotely from Mississippi, and they brought an exciting style of offense to their respective programs, a new level of kind of swagger and kind of the new age of college football, where a lot of these coaches are very much players coaches, and that's exactly what you get with Leach and Kiffin. And of course, Kiffin and his brand of social media, and his
love it
is used to branding not only on social media but just him as a person, his personality. Mike Leach, kind of similar, and not so much on the social media side, but just more of just the personality side, because he has a personality that is just a media person's dream almost. Some of the stuff that he says and some of the opinions that he has on the game brings a lot of that. But both coaches seem to have really cultivated their respective bases in Mississippi down. So I think Lane Kiffin has kind of had a little bit an edge just since they've been in there, because Ole Miss, or Lane Kiffin being 2-0 against Mike Leach so far since doing here. But Mike Leach has got a good ball club coming up. A lot of teams are writing them off as well. But Ole Miss, they're a team that has a ridiculously high ceiling, but at the same time they have a very low floor as well, just because you have a lot of good transfers coming in. Question is, how are they going to mesh together? And that's the big question mark with Ole Miss going into the season.
Yeah, and Lane Kiffin went full board into the transfer portal, replenishing all 11 starters lost from last year, especially quarterback. The number 2 team transfer portal ranking team behind USC, and obviously a lot of teams are doing that, but Lane Kiffin really made a point to replenish that talent lost from last year with the transfer portal.
I think that's one of the first things that he mentioned when his introductory press conference. He was mentioning, or someone asked about, roster assembly and what's that going to look like now that the transfer portal is that going to thing. And Lane Kiffin said, make no mistake about it, there is free agency in college football now. Of course, he was a former head coach himself, as the head coach of the Oakland Raiders at times. He's worked at quality control analyst, with the Jacksonville Jaguars. So he's been around NFL programs to know what free agency is like. And, I think because Lane Kiffin has been so all in with the transfer portal and all that, I think the high school recruiting classes haven't been quite as impressive as some previous Ole Miss recruiting classes under, Matt Luke and Hugh Freeze and the rest of them. But at the same time, I think with Lane Kiffin, this is the type of thing that benefits his system the most. Some of the things that he mentions the most, other than #come to the SIP, is pro mindset, and the mindset of just coming in, not being distracted, going to work, and just treat it. You're going to have fun here, but at the same time, you're going to develop, and you're going to basically become a professional in the process of playing your college football. And I think that's something, part of his identity, that he's really cultivated so far. And, I think that statement is a lot more evident this year with a lot of these transfers coming up around the country, and some pretty darn good ones too. Like you mentioned, the top 2 or number 2 recruiting class behind USC, number 1 at one point. But very top heavy with some of the transfers they brought in at quarterback, at running back, and on the defensive line and so forth.
Yeah, it's all about quarterback. I mean, that's, whenever there's a replacing of quarterback, especially when replacing a lot Matt Corral, who did everything for Ole Miss last season, you could really tell the drop off when he did come off the field, like in the Sugar Bowl against Baylor. I still believe Ole Miss would have won that game had Matt Corral played that one out. Of course, Luke Altmaier, he's the one that came in, and he showed some good things in the spring game. He looked very steady, calm, like he ran the offense well. And I've seen some comments with Jackson Dart from Lane Kiffin. He makes a lot of big plays, but there may be some mistakes in there. What is your read on the quarterback situation at Ole Miss?
That's the big thing about going into this season. Of course, Jackson Dart was one of those when players like to bring up, Spencer Rattler in the portal, if they want to bring up Dylan Gabriel in the portal. Ole Miss was in the running for both of those guys. Both ended up going elsewhere because, Lane Kiffin, one thing he does love is his quarterbacks. And he's coached a lot of good quarterbacks in his tenure. But Jackson Dart was, I think, the next name mentioned after Gabriel, if I'm not mistaken. And obviously everyone knows the picture that went viral with him in front of a Porsche or some fancy car in Oxford. Just goes to show that, that Jackson Dart's type of swagger kind of goes hand in hand with what Kiffin does in that regard. And, he was a guy who was hurt, at USC last year. Got to play, not all that much, but, he was a really good high school quarterback. But, when he came in, he also had some really good guys around him, like the Zach Evanses of the world, the Michael Triggs of the world, a former teammate of his, and Michael Tripp, who ended up following him there, or if maybe the other way around, if I'm not mistaken. But at the same time, in the spring game, he kind of underwhelmed in the spring game. Luke Altmaier, like you saw in the Sugar Bowl last year, for the situation that Altmaier was in, he did his job. Now, there were some mistakes that he did where he kind of forced some passes and all that, but that was mainly just out of desperation, trying to get something to happen. The pick six was not his fault in that game with the ball being tipped and not very good protection there. But the one at the end was just trying to make something happen. So Altmaier was a really good quarterback out of high school as well. I covered him since his freshman year of high school in Starkville, of all places, Starkville. He's very kind of composed. Of course, he showed a lot of composure for somebody who was playing, high school ball, just the year prior. But, Jackson Dart was a lot more college experience. But at the same time, Jackson Dart was just trying to win that quarterback competition right away in the spring game, kind of make that statement. Because the general consensus was, okay, Jackson Dart's coming in. Lane Kiffin's wearing a Corral 2 hoodie on his thing. That's Jackson Dart's number. Is that a reference to Corral? Is that a reference to Jackson Dart? We don't know. Lane, you could leave that up to your own interpretations. But Dart did not have a good spring game. Threw 3 interceptions, some pretty ugly balls. Now, granted, he was working with the second team a little bit, but Luke Altmaier, was decent. I'm not going to say that either quarterback was very terrible or very incredible. It's just based on spring game. But one thing about either one, they're going to have a really, really good target to throw to in Michael Trigg. And I think that's the transfer I think a lot of Ole Miss fans are going to be excited about. So the quarterback competition is basically wide open going into this thing. So ask me in about 3 weeks, and I could probably give you a better answer.
Yeah, you talking about Michael Trigg on my notes here. Who I want to talk about just watching his athleticism, his length. I mean, he looks like a power forward out there going for the rebound, boxing out on some of the touchdowns he scored in the spring game, and that's a good weapon for any new quarterback to have. Don't you? Got that guy? Just throw it up, he will go get it. But I got some other guys there as well. I know Drummond and Sanders, they're gone. They're gone from the program. But you do have Jonathan Mingo. I know only played 6 games last year, but he's coming back. You got the Louisville transfer and Jordan Watkins. What's your overall input or thoughts on the supporting cast around whoever's going to be the quarterback?
I think Michael Trigg is going to make an impact right away. I mean, make no mistake about it. Even though the spring game is the spring game, but just his size and his stature just makes it an automatic mismatch. Now, if he could break open from defenders, that would be even better on his thing. But outside, you got Jonathan Mingo, who was a prize Mississippi recruit out of high school in that same recruiting class. As Jerry and Ely, as Snoop Connor, 2 running backs who made an impact last year. John Rice Plumlee, part of that class as well, if I'm not mistaken, on the top of my head. But Mingo was a guy who, what could have been last year had he not gotten hurt right before the Alabama game, which at that point was the biggest game of the career. And pretty sure we all kind of know what happened after that game.
Yeah.
But that was oof. But, Mingo, he has all throughout his career, he's always had those games where he would have, 10 catches for 100 yards, or he would barely make an impact, whether he's playing hobbled up or whether he's 100% healthy. It's going to be interesting to see how that consistency kind of translates into next year. He's going to be kind of the elder statesman in that receiver room. But, a guy who looks the part and looks like a prototypical SEC receiver and looks like a lot of Ole Miss receivers in recent years who have worn that number 1 jersey, from A.J. Brown to Laquan Treadwell right before him, just big-bodied physical receivers, and Mingo was one of those guys. Jordan Watkins, with everything in Louisville, guy who Ole Miss saw last year, I think I'm not mistaken, or I don't know if he was in that game, if he made that big of an impact. But he's good shifty guy. Good quick twitch. If he can get open, that's going to make all the difference if he can get the ball in his hands. JJ Henry, young guy who made a big impact in the spring game I think is going to make an impact a little bit too. Dennis Jackson was a receiver last year that kind of threw into the fire a little bit, especially with all the injuries at receiver. Mingo being the big one. Braylon Sanders and Dontario Drummond each had their fair share of injuries. You look against games at LSU, games against Auburn. I think Auburn was the game where they basically
I remember
had 90% of their receiving yards not even being able to play, especially with Drummond going down the injury with a hamstring injury on a double pass of all things. And of course, that was the reason why Corral also kind of had to run for his life too a little bit. So it's going to be interesting to see how that depth at receiver kind of builds up. And I think either of those guys do that. Hudson Wolf was a tight end who was injured for most of the year. It's going to be interesting to see if he can, finally show that potential. I mentioned Dennis Jackson at the top of my head. You have some others that are kind of vying for that role. Braylon Buckhalter, another one of those guys. And I think you're not really going to find a pecking order at this point, just up until fall ball, because I think that's when some of these guys, either emerge or you realize that, they may not make an impact this year in the SEC, let alone this season.
Yeah, and on the defensive side of the ball for Ole Miss, this is a team that showed great improvement from first year under Lane Kiffin to second. I think the first year, 2020, they gave up 38 points per game. Last year it was around the 24-25 mark, and they got a veteran secondary coming back, and a lot of guys that can get to the quarterback on this team as well. I mean, Sam Williams, of course, gone up front. He's in the NFL now, but you got guys like, Cedric Johnson, Tavares Robinson, Katie Hill. They got transfers coming in there too as well. What's your thoughts on this defense coming into this season?
I think I'm most excited about the defensive line, as you already mentioned kind of some of the names right there. Of course, Cedric Johnson, was clearly talented, but often he was overshadowed by Sam Williams, who was almost a number one or a first-round draft pick. Just took basically the SEC by storm with what he did on the defensive line, his pass rushing abilities to make him a full-time defensive lineman. But, there's so many names like there. Of course, Cedric Johnson and Katie Hill that are those returning starters. You got Jared Ivey transferring from Georgia Tech, and that kid's going to be something special. And I'll tell you who I'm most excited about, and I'm a little bit biased because I am a local Oxford native, and I'm sorry to bring this up, but JJ Piggies.
I've got him on my notes because I have an additional question with him, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, but JJ, I have a soft spot for him. He's, the last name Piggies is a local Oxford household name. If you're from around here, everybody in their family is ridiculously athletic. Everybody in this extended family. But just a big guy. You're like, okay, is this guy going to be a receiver? Is this guy going to be a tight end? I mean, I think he was signed at Auburn as a tight end under Malzahn.
He was.
And one of the reasons why he signed with Auburn was because he had a defined role, and that Kiffin hadn't quite made as much contact with him, and him being coming in right at signing day or during that time. But, you saw at Auburn last year, he just got better and better as the year kind of went on. He didn't have the stats to quite back it up, but his pass rushing ability, I think you can kind of see doing that. He had a phenomenal spring game. He even was put in at a tight end for a 2-point conversion on one play during the spring game, which kind of gave me some high school flashbacks, covering the Oxford Chargers. My former high school, his former high school, winning the school's first state championship, all pretty much on his back, along with a quarterback that went to Navy. But he's going to be phenomenal. You have Demon Clowney, who got to see a little bit of time last year. Tywon Malone, who also plays baseball, wasn't on the travel roster for the national championship run, but just a freaky athletic guy. And he moves very fast for somebody of that stature. And then guys like Isaiah Iton, who got a little bit of stuff last year, Jamon Gordon. So there's so much depth on that defensive line. Linebackers is the thing that I think is a little bit most concerning, especially losing Chance Campbell and Mark Robinson, and just both phenomenal linebackers last year. But Troy Brown's going to come in and make an immediate impact. You have other guys who can they have Otis Reese kind of in that safety role, was a difference maker when being reinstated in 2020 for the transfer because of a transfer situation, made an impact right away, made an impact on last year's team. AJ Finley was probably arguably the biggest returner from last year. He's kind of the veteran presence out there in the secondary. Tysheem Johnson was a guy who got better and better and found his way into a starting role as well. Darius Tennyson, also him, who
dipping in Auburn a little bit.
Yeah, he's undersized, but I can tell you, like watching him, that guy can play. It's going to be interesting to see if he actually makes the start or not. Miles Battle, who they moved from receiver to corner, made an interception in the Sugar Bowl, made a couple of game-changing plays down the road. Those are some of the headliners, I guess, on defense. But at the same time, Davison Big Benison, sorry. The last name I'm still trying to work on a little bit. Okay. He has a chance as a true freshman to basically come in and start right away. He was an early enrollee as well. So those are some of the ones on the top of my head. At the same time, fall ball hasn't happened, so you kind of get a little bit better of an idea. You see their potential. At the same time, you don't know how how you feel about them closer to the season.
Yeah, you kind of answered one of my questions, and I forgot. I had forgotten about the spring game. Looking back, that they put JJ Pregeese out there at tight end. That's what I was going to think. I just wonder if Lane Kiffin's going to get creative with him on the offense side of the ball.
I guarantee you, I think he's going to. Kiffin's a very gimmicky coach.
Yes,
I think there's no mistake in that. I think Kiffin's one of those guys, and he's very aggressive in doing so. He's not going to hold back, especially when the game is on the line. Even in times where it's kind of basically unexpected. I think he tried a fake field goal from his own 35-yard line when Auburn came to Oxford in 2020 with a little flip back behind his head that worked out terribly. But I think that goes to show there's kind of the new age of college football where you're getting a lot more aggressive with your play calls and analytics. The numbers don't lie. And I think Kiffin has fully embraced that since coming to Oxford. And of course, he attempts more fourth downs than anyone in the country. Conversion, I don't know what it is at the top of my head, but it's 7 is always better than 3, and that's something that he'll always say.
You got to hate being a punter for Lane Kiffin. I mean, because you're not going to see the field a lot. I mean, you're probably saying, okay, good, we're moving the ball. I don't have to see the field, but again, I would like to get some kicks out there. So you're not going to. It's not going to be one of them situations if you're the punter for Ole Miss or a Lane Kiffin coach team. You're going to see the field often.
Yeah, I don't know exactly who's going to be the starting punter. I think I remember during the spring game who it was. At the same time, there wasn't really a lot of punting, not only just because there were points scored, but there were a lot of turnovers in that game as well.
Yeah.
I think that was a legitimate concern, too, in turnovers. Obviously, I mentioned with Jackson Dart and a couple things, and there were some great plays defensively as well. And I think you're going to expect. I don't know if you're going to get last year's defense on the surface level. Especially with DJ Durkin go to A&M, and I think Chris Partridge is a very, very good defensive coordinator, and he's going to have a lot of help with some great defensive coaching staff additions that he had. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens, especially if they go back to kind of that drop 8 type mentality and kind of let the secondary kind of just raise Cain a little bit.
And looking at the schedule, Auburn State open up with Troy, and I'm going to pull the curtain back and tell you this, and I said this to the guests I have early on this week. I had the voice of the Troy Trojans, Barry, and when I booked the podcast for the week, I didn't even look at the schedule, so I just knew who I wanted. So it's kind of funny. I've got Troy and Ole Miss this week on the show, and those two teams play each other opening year. Non-conference game at Georgia Tech, Tulsa. The crossover games are Kentucky and Vanderbilt. Alabama game is late in the year, in November this year on November 12th. Just Ole Miss schedule. When you look at that, what do you think for the Ole Miss fans listening to this or watching this, what are reasonable expectations you think for this season?
You kind of mentioned at the beginning of the show, I think this team on the surface, as we stand right now, has a very high ceiling. Which means they can have potential to possibly go 10-2 again. But at the same time, they could possibly go 7-5 because a lot of those games can kind of go either way. Now, they did not get quite as tough of a non-conference schedule this year. I'm not saying that that Georgia Tech and Tulsa and Troy and Central Arkansas are things that you should obviously overlook because you shouldn't overlook any opponent. But Troy's had some competitive years, and they're led by a former Ole Miss assistant in John Sumrall.
Yeah.
So that's not going to be really a pushover either. And Troy's going to be competitive, especially with those games playing in the SEC. It's going to kind of be their Super Bowl. a little bit, and despite how overmatched they are, and they are obviously overmatched in that one, and it's the Central Arkansas. Georgia Tech is going to pose a little bit of a presence because Georgia Tech has a phenomenal group of athletes, a lot of kids from the the local Atlanta area. That's kind of a big base of theirs. And Tulsa has kind of been, one of those teams in non-conference that's kind of nips at teams' heels.
Mm-hmm.
And they play with the edge and they play with a chip on their shoulder. And that's going to be one of those, I think, where Ole Miss, I'm not just saying that just based on the, the brawl that broke out in that bowl game in 2020, but, they play with a chip on the shoulder. And, that's kind of how you really need to play. You need to play, willing to do it, ready to, to kick the other guy's butt on the other side of the field. But
Yeah.
I'm not gonna say there'd be a pushover either. Kentucky, everyone's saying that's gonna be an automatic win. That's gonna be a lot better game, I think, than a lot of people realize. Mark Stoops doesn't get any credit that he deserves as Kentucky's head coach. And the thing that he did there to not make it look like, your father's or your grandfather's Kentucky,
Yeah, they're a different deal.
They were a 10-win team last year for a reason. And they weren't even as good, and they may not even been as good as the 2018 team that was also around that thing too. So they have multiple 10-win seasons in a couple years, and so I think they're going to be there to stay in the SEC East. That's going to push over Vanderbilt. Ole Miss always plays Vanderbilt in there, but the thing is, it gets from a really easy schedule at the beginning to a ridiculous gauntlet at the end. Especially with the top of my head, you correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not looking at the schedule right now. It's Alabama, A&M, and Auburn all back to back to back. Maybe not in that order, but that's going to be a really brutal stretch. Kind of like what I believe it was Arkansas or Alabama, Arkansas, and Tennessee was last year. And almost went 2-1 in that stretch. So but then again, a lot of injuries could happen at that point in the season. Maybe certain guys don't emerge. Maybe Altmaier or Dart don't perform like they're supposed to at the offensive line with the addition of Mason Brooks, and some of those returners don't really do their job, or defensively they relapse the 2020 team. A lot of things could happen, but that last stretch is going to be huge, especially if Ole Miss is going to try and make another New Year's Six bowl.
Yeah, I was looking at it right here. It's the 15th of October. You got Auburn, then you go to LSU, to A&M. You're off. Host Alabama, at Arkansas, then close out the season on Thursday night at home against Mississippi State.
And let me say this about Auburn too. And I think a lot of people are writing off Auburn too, and I think it's a little bit unfair to do so. I know people are not happy with Brian Harsin, especially with the way that the season ended last year, despite having a top 10 win, one of them being Ole Miss. But that roster, has so much talent on it. They've always been littered with talent every year. Now, some of it did leave to go to other places, and it's just a matter of what's gonna happen with there. How are they gonna respond to such a monumental collapse last year? But that's not going to be a pushover at all. Plus, Auburn's won 4 straight against Ole Miss last year. It's kind of, there was a period of time, past couple of years where Arkansas was kind of a boogeyman to Ole Miss. Auburn's kind of been that boogeyman to Ole Miss kind of in recent years. You talk about not even you look from 18 to 21. You look back at the 2014 game where where Auburn shattered Ole Miss's college football playoff dreams and Laquan Treadwell's leg. But I think the Auburn game is going to be just as tough, given the stretch of games.
Oh yeah, it's an interesting schedule. And I was looking at and was diving deep into it last night. I was thinking, that's like you said, that second half, a lot of big games there, and against all the SEC West teams. So
they can easily go 7-0. But at the same time, are they going to finish 7-5 or 8-4? Who knows?
It's going to be intriguing. Like I said,
especially with just the new age of college football and how things are kind of changing and all that, and how that affects kind of a quote unquote small market team like Ole Miss, who may not have the deep pockets, for collectives and NIL like some of these blue blood programs you talk about, Texas and Alabama, Miami, and Ohio State, and USC, Oklahoma, Florida, and so forth. It's we haven't quite we're starting to swing that pendulum kind of in that area. But who transfers, who stays, who checks out, who doesn't. It's going to be one of the craziest college football team. Yeah, it's going to be one of the craziest college football seasons I think that will ever experience in our lifetime coming up. So you can hold me to that.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been one of the crazier off season in college football history. So the season, it's got to live up to that as well. And I appreciate it, Jared, for you coming on this edition of Talking College Football. I told you 20 minutes. We're about to hit the 30-minute mark here, but it's been a great conversation with you, having you on the first time, having you on any of my podcasts. I do appreciate the time. If the listeners wanting to follow you online and the viewers, where can they find you and all the work you're doing at Inside the Rebels over at 247 Sports?
Yeah, you can first find it by one way, InsideTheRebels.com, or you can go to 247sports.com/college/Ole Miss. Google Ole Miss 24/7. You can find it that way as well. You can find all of my my coverage externally on Twitter at Jared E. Redding. And so, yeah, you can. So a lot of that kind of goes hand in hand and all that. You could find some funny traffic tweets. You could find some funny food tweets. If you're good for the entertainment outside of that, if you're not looking for just sports, you can follow me on Twitter, Jared E. Redding, that way. But all my sports stuff you can find at InsideTheRebels.com with all of our coverage with myself, my publisher, David Johnson, Chris Brooks, Brad Logan, Tyler Kumas, and so forth.
All right. Sounds good, Jared. And again, appreciate the time, and hope we can do this again sometime down the road.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
All right, everybody, and that's going to do it for this edition of Talking College Football. Hope you enjoyed that preview of the Ole Miss Rebels. It was a lot of fun. We'll have more previews coming up here on the podcast as we count down to the 2022 college football season. Remember, you can follow me on social media at PJordanSEC. You can follow the show on Twitter at TalkingCFBPod. Of course, you can always email me at sportstalkphillipjordan@gmail.com. Check out the video form of the show over on YouTube, the Phillip Jordan Sports YouTube channel. There's also a Talking College Football YouTube channel as well. Go to either one, hit subscribe button, hit the bell for all the notifications, and please leave a comment. I will read those on a future edition of the show. And also, if you go over on Apple Podcasts, follow, rate, review, leave a review, same thing there. And check out on all the other platforms, Spotify, iHeart, wherever you get your podcast. Check out Talking College Football. Go check out the Phillip Jordan podcast as well. There's still stuff going up on that feed too as well, non-college football stuff. Just interesting stuff over there as well on that one. And as always, you can email me at sportstalkphillipjordan@gmail.com. Got a NFL-related podcast coming up on the YouTube channel on Thursday, previewing the NFC East with Brian Manning from Commander's Wire, part of USA Today. Hope you'll check that out. Good 30-minute conversation me and Brian had earlier in the week previewing the NFC East. So that's some stuff I'll be doing over on the YouTube channel as well here in the coming weeks as we head into the NFL season. But this is College Football Show, you know that. But also, if you're looking for some NFL content, and that episode also show up on the Phillip Jordan podcast feed as well. Hope everybody has a great Wednesday. Check out the NFL Pod, but if you don't, I hope everybody has a great rest of the week. Until next time, bye-bye.